Today we're continuing our sermon series looking at the 7 deadly sins. In this installment, we're looking at the sin of lust. Now, lust is both a sin we feel embarrassed to talk about, but at least on a societal level, we often treat it as if it's no big deal. After all, lust doesn't do any direct, concrete harm to another person. And while it's true that no one has ever died because someone had a lustful thought about them, lust causes serious, if insidious, harm to people. Lust distorts our thinking about others, and that distorted thinking leads to all sorts of degrading and harmful behaviors, ranging from the icky, like ogling, to the downright catastrophic, like rape. Metaphorically, we could see that sex is like fire, and when used well, fire can help you cook your food and keep your house warm. But when it's abused, fire can burn down your house. Well, if sex is fire, then lust is gasoline sloshed around your living room, and it makes controlling what must be controlled virtually impossible. Because lust is so destructive, Jesus has some very strong words to say about it. In Matthew 5:27-30, he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for the whole body to go into hell." Contrary to the attitude in our culture, Jesus thinks that lust is a big deal. While it may be a secret sin, confined to our minds, Jesus' word points to the idea that it has a habit of spilling out into our external actions. And while Jesus is certainly employing hyperbole when he talks about self-mutilation, his basic point is that if we aren't ruthless in dealing with the sins that outwardly seem like no big deal, we may find that they lead to very real consequences in our lives. So when we talk about lust, what are we talking about? Well, first, while the church has sometimes lost sight of this, lust is not the same thing as sexual desire. Sexual desire is a good thing created by God. So the call to avoid lust is not saying that we need to repress our sexuality. Instead, sex, like other good gifts from God, can be used to enhance life and flourishing, or it can be abused to our detriment. Lust, then, is disordered sexual desire. To lust is to treat a human being, an image bearer of God, as less than human, an object to be used for the gratification of our sexual desire. But people are more than their sexuality, and when we ignore that reality, we cause problems. In order to understand the problem lust causes, we need to understand a Christian perspective on what it means to be human. The Bible teaches us that we're a strange hybrid of spirit and physical body. These two portions of ourselves are inseparable. One of the earliest Christian heresies, Gnosticism, denied this idea, supposing that our physical bodies were like prisons that we needed to escape from. By denying the unity of the body and the spirit, Gnosticism taught that what people did with their bodies didn't matter. This is a harmful and false teaching. First, it fails to grasp how our bodies and our spirits are joined together. Our bodies act according to the will of our spirit. So if I sin, it's not just a body problem, it's also a spiritual problem. If I punch and kick and bite you, I can't say, "Oh, sorry, that was just my body doing that." Because, of course, my body was acting at the direction of my spirit. Second, the teaching that the body is bad or unimportant denies the goodness of the physical world. In the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, there are 6 times where it pauses to say that God saw what he had created and it was good. And there's a 7th opportunity or time right after the human being is placed into creation where it says that what God saw was very good. So creation, this physical world, is good. And when God puts his image, human bodies, into this creation, it is very good. We are made in the image of God. Our physical form represents God to the world. Or as John Paul II wrote, The body, in fact, and it alone, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and divine. So having a body is a good gift from God. The problem isn't that we have bodies. The problem is that our bodies don't do so well in a world that is affected by sin. So our bodies aren't disposable. Rather, they have become corrupted and need to be renewed. Now, a third problem with this Gnostic view of the body is that it denies the incarnation. John tells us that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That's John 1:14. God took on a human body. And if the fullness of God can dwell in a human body, as Paul says in Colossians 2:9, then having a body is a dignified thing. So our physical and spiritual duality is not a bad thing, but a very good thing. But lust denies that this is so. If I lust someone, I act as if they are just a body. And I act as if my desire towards that person is a purely physical matter that doesn't also affect my spirit. I ignore and downplay the interconnection between my body and my spirit. And it says to the person lusted after, you're just a body to me. The rest of you doesn't matter. So we deny the way that God has created us, and it distorts how we live. Now, of course, all of this theological stuff can seem rather abstract when we are tempted by lust. But the harms of lusting aren't just mere abstractions. They're very real. First, lust promises us pleasure if we indulge it. Many people say that lust is a good thing. Indulging it allows us to relieve the sexual tension that is built up in our life. But giving ourselves permission to lust doesn't relieve the problem. It actually makes it worse. It's like being thirsty and drinking seawater. The more you drink, the thirstier you get. As the writer of Proverbs says, death and destruction are never satisfied, and neither are human eyes. In the end, lusting doesn't relieve sexual tension. It just trains us to look at other people as objects and robs us then of our ability to relate to others in a healthy way, which leaves us feeling isolated and more prone to lusting, which makes it into a vicious cycle. Lust causes harm in lots of different ways, and I want to quickly outline different spheres of our life that are negatively affected by it. First, lust devastates us personally by eroding empathy. When we've conditioned ourselves to see others as objects, we just don't care all that much when those apparent objects experience pain or injustice. So, for example, when men see women as objects, even if they don't engage in overtly misogynistic behavior, well, they're not quite so bothered when they see other people doing that sort of thing. So whether it's men catcalling after women or taking advantage of them when they're drunk, they're more likely to think, what's the big deal? And when we've learned to treat people as objects, we become unable to see their human dignity. And this stops us from building healthy relationships with them. Second, lust destroys us relationally by destroying trust and intimacy. A person who is given over to disordered sexual desire can't experience proper sexual fulfillment in marriage because they don't have the tools necessary to build a commitment in order to sustain an emotionally healthy marriage. A person given to lust begins to associate shame and sexual gratification. So even when they experience sexual intimacy within marriage, they have lingering feelings of dirtiness. Lust destroys intimacy in marriage. If someone is secretly longing after a different partner than the one that they have, they're probably going to also project that longing onto their partner and think that they would rather be with someone else too, which makes us feel deeply insecure. Also, it ruins relationships because it trains us to see even our spouses as objects of desire instead of full humans with hopes and dreams and needs that aren't sexual in nature. We lose our ability to relate to our spouse holistically, and so our relationship becomes stunted as a result. Finally, lust destroys us socially by building up industries that exploit. The pornographic industry exists as a consequence of lust. And while we like to tell ourselves that the porn industry and the people involved in it freely choose what they do, and they're fairly compensated for it, I think it's a little more complicated than that. An alcoholic can freely choose to drink, but in the throes of their addiction, we can't say that they're actually free. A person participating in porn can freely choose to do so, but it may be as a consequence of the brokenness in their life, rather than something that is truly freely chosen. Plus, it's naive to believe that all of the women and boys involved in pornography have freely chosen it. There's likely a great deal of coercion involved. Human trafficking exists because of lust. Most of the people who are trafficked against their will to feed the demand for prostitution. And if our society didn't normalize lust, I think a great deal less of that would happen. We can see the destructive power of lust on display in the tragic story of David and Bathsheba. David's a great king. He's brave, he's humble, he's committed to God. But even a man of such renown is susceptible to lust. And when David indulges his lust, his decision-making process is hijacked by his libido. He finds himself engaging in actions that his normal, God-fearing, rational self would never have considered. We read about this terrible downfall in 2 Samuel chapter 11, starting in verse 2. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I'm pregnant." Well, we like to say it takes two to tango. This sexual relationship is initiated by David. The NIV sanitizes the account by saying that he sent people to get her. The actual word is to take her in Hebrew. The power imbalance between David and Bathsheba means that Bathsheba's not really free to refuse her king. And the unexpected pregnancy that results from the sexual encounter is a big complication. Of course, David tries to cover it up by recalling her husband, Uriah the Hittite, from the battle, hoping that, while he's home, he'll sleep with his wife, giving the pregnancy a patina of legitimacy. But when Uriah returns to the battle without having had relations to his wife, David arranges to have him killed, and then he takes Bathsheba for himself. The prophet Nathan confronts David for his actions, explains that a number of serious consequences will occur. This is part of what he says, found in 2 Samuel 12, 9-14. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am bringing calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with them in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." Then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." So at this point, David's reign begins to unravel in a cascading series of consequences. Having lost credibility to restrain his children's sexual indulgence because of his own discretions, David sees conflict erupt in his own house. His daughter Tamar is raped by her half-brother, David's eldest son, Amnon. Tamar's brother Absalom murders Amnon and eventually tries to kill David to usurp his throne, openly raping David's concubines, fulfilling one of Nathan's predictions. And of course, this incident ends with Absalom dead. And when David's son Solomon takes over, his reign begins with great promise, but collapses at the end because, just like his father before him, lust leads him into sin. If all of this can happen because of harmless lust, then we need to take it seriously. As with the other deadly sins, to combat the power of a vice, we need to cultivate a corresponding virtue. The virtue that opposes lust is chastity. Now, the word chastity is often understood as a synonym for celibacy, but that's not what I mean here. If lust is disordered sexual desire, chastity is properly ordered sexual desire. To be chaste isn't necessarily to refrain from all sexual activity, but to limit it to what is approved and constructive. For single people, this means abstinence before marriage. For married people, it means faithfulness to your spouse. Not just avoiding sexual relations with others, but also relating to your spouse as a whole being and not an object. And for both married and single people, chastity means disciplining our thinking, not giving ourselves permission to objectify others for our sexual gratification. For unmarried people, chastity has a number of benefits. First, it allows them to relate to others, even attractive people, in a more rewarding way. Long ago, before I met Carolyn, I had many friends who were girls, and I could go out with them for coffee. And because I wasn't acting towards them as if they were objects and just relating to them as friends, it was a very rewarding group of friendships at a time when I would otherwise have been more lonely. Now, for some people, a friendship like that can blossom into a romantic relationship and finally into a marriage. And if that's the case, the relationship would likely be healthier, since from the beginning, you've learned to relate to that person as a whole person rather than as an object. Being chaste also means that when a single person does marry, they're not going to be implicitly comparing their spouse to their past sexual partners, and they won't bring into their marriage unrealistic expectations that they may have received from viewing pornography. Second, avoiding lust helps single people avoid destructive decisions where sexual desire might warp their decision-making process. When people are in the throes of desire, they're prone to do things their rational, dispassionate self would be horrified by. David was not the first person to do something stupid while he was under the influence of lust, and he certainly won't be the last. This is such a part of the human experience that Homer wrote a thinly veiled allegory about this in his poem, The Odyssey. In that poem, the sirens are monstrous creatures who nonetheless enchant sailors to sail to their deaths. Having been warned that he will encounter the sirens with their deadly song, Odysseus has his crew tie him to the mast of his ship and has them all fill their ears with wax so they can neither hear the sirens' call nor his pleas to be untied from the mast. It might not feel very nice to ignore the siren's call, but in the long run, it can save us from utter disaster. For the married, chastity also has benefits. First, by avoiding lust, you preserve the passion in your marital relations. Lusting after someone else will naturally cause dissatisfaction with your spouse. But by choosing not to indulge, you will enjoy the sexual relations you can lawfully have with your spouse more. Second, chastity leads us to treat our spouse as a whole person, allowing us to relate to them in a more helpful way. Marriage is hard. It involves learning to lay down what you want so that you can generously give the other person what they want. And the emotional bond that allows us to love our spouse in this way happens when we relate to them as a holistic person rather than as an object. Because if we objectify our spouse, their needs will become an inconvenience that we resent rather than an opportunity to grow in love. Third, and very practically, chastity keeps us further away from adultery. Jesus warns us that lust is adultery because he understands that when we indulge in lust, we erode the inhibitions that keep us faithful to our spouse. Few sins that are common among Christians have as much destructive potential as adultery. Adultery rips families apart. How many kids are there in our community who suffer tremendous emotional damage because their parents' marriage broke up due to infidelity? And what our kids observe us doing becomes their baseline for understanding what is normal. So setting an example of adultery is a gift that keeps on giving, if you will, because children who accept infidelity as normal start their marriages at a significant disadvantage. So chastity keeps us from venturing into the place where those dark possibilities become more and more probabilities. Now, learning to be chaste involves developing strategies that keep us from lust. Here are some practical tips that we can do to do that. First, train yourself to think about people as a unified whole. When you see an attractive person and are tempted to fixate on their sexual attractiveness, instead focus on the whole person and pray God's blessing for them. So, for example, a man might see a beautiful woman And rather than lusting, he might discipline his mind and pray something like this: Lord, I can see that this is a very beautiful woman, but I know she's so much more than that. She's someone's daughter. She has hopes and dreams, a personality, a sense of humor, and other gifts from you, not just an attractive body. So I pray that you will allow me to see her as a whole person, not just an object to be used. Please bless her and allow her to find other people who respect her for who she is and not treat her just as an attractive body. This serves as a reminder that she cannot be flattened down to a purely sexual dimension. A second way of avoiding lust is to set up accountability relationships. Ask a fellow believer to ask you how you're doing in this area on a regular basis. And you need to commit to being honest with them. It's not about coming up with some sort of punishment that they can inflict on you if you blow it. But knowing that you're going to have to give an account for your actions means that you'll think twice before indulging. And it has the added benefit that this person can act as a priest for you in the times when you do fail. They can pray for you in your places in times of weakness, and when you confess your sins, they can assure you of God's absolution of your sins. Third, we need to avoid situations of foreseeable temptation. This involves an honest self-assessment, asking yourself where you're vulnerable. You might need to make adjustments, and those adjustments might feel very inconvenient. Maybe you need to install a browser nanny software on your computer and your phone where it can send a report to that accountability partner. In our internet-connected age, it's become very difficult to avoid lust because the things that inflame our passions are so easy to find. Additionally, there may be places you need to avoid going. Maybe you can't handle seeing all those bodies in swimsuits, and so you need to avoid the beach. It might feel like cutting off your hand or gouging out your eye to keep yourself away from these things that tempt you. Avoiding lust is hard work, but we must remember that lust and the behaviors that it leads to must be taken seriously. Finally, I want to look at what happens when we fail. In the last several years, people have begun to reckon with the unhealthy legacy of the sexual purity movement of the 80s and 90s. The sexual purity movement was a well-intentioned way of encouraging right behavior, but perhaps not always with the most constructive way. I've often come back to the realization that as Christians, what we stand for is important, but so is how we stand for it. And on one hand, those in our culture who say that regulating sexual behavior is inhuman are, I think, wrong-headed. Given the negative consequences we've seen from unregulated lust and the behaviors that grow from it, well, we can see that that's just not a good option. Yet using shame and guilt to regulate sexual behavior also isn't the answer. As Christians, we need a positive vision of why chastity is good, not just a negative reason or vision for why lust is bad. We need to know God's expectations, but we must also remember God's grace. If you're unmarried and you've blown it, maybe you've looked at porn or engaged in sex before marriage, your past failures don't need to swallow up your future hopes. You're not used goods who will henceforth live under a cloud of God's judgment. If you're a married person, the same is also true. However, if you have committed adultery, there may be serious consequences. However, honesty with your spouse about your failings gives you the best chance to save your marriage. If your infidelity is discovered by your spouse rather than confessed to them, the outcome will almost certainly be worse. It is God's will for marriages, of course, to be permanent, but sometimes adultery so breaks the trust in a marriage that there's no practical way for it to continue forward. So, yeah, sin has consequences. But remember that God is gracious. Going back to the story of David and Bathsheba, we see this grace alongside the consequences. In the Torah, both the adultery that David committed and the murder that he committed to cover it up are capital offenses. But Nathan absolves David of guilt when he humbles himself and confesses his sin. David found that God was forgiving. Following his failure, he wrote the psalm that we read this morning. And the psalm includes these verses. This is Psalm 51, 7-12. Clean me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. So let's live in a pure way, but also remember that our past failures will never put us outside of God's grace. Your past failure doesn't need to be your future failure because there is no limit to God's ability to save and to transform.